All right. I suppose we're live, and perhaps it's a good time to get started. All right. Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this ISMT panel discussion on trust and peer review, paper mills, and predatory publishers. I'm Jay Suarez, Senior Associate Publisher at the ACS and a co-organizer for this year's ISMT programming for the North American region. Just a couple of housekeeping items. Our panelists will take questions at the end. And also, please feel free to use the Q&A function at any point to enter questions. If you would like to ask a question to a specific speaker, please use the and sign and the name of the speaker when entering your question. And of course, last but not least, a big thank you and a shout out to our event sponsors, AGA, ACS Publications, Adapon, Cabell's International, Origin Reports, and Scholastica. So here to kick us off, I'd like to introduce Laura Fisher, who's an executive editor for the journal RSC Advances at the Royal Society of Chemistry. Laura joined the RSC in 2014 and previously worked as publishing editor and then deputy editor for the journals Soft Matter, Polymer Chemistry, Biomaterial Science, Reaction Chemistry and Engineering, and MSDE. Laura is an advocate for improving inclusion and diversity in publishing and worked on updating the RSC's author name change policy. She has also a keen interest in publishing ethics. And with that, Laura, stage is all yours.
Great, thank you, Jay. I will share my screen. And I'm hoping you can all see my slides now, but please shout if you can't.
Yes, we can see it.
Great. So hi, everyone. And as Jay said, my name's Laura, and I'm the executive editor for RSC Advances at the Royal Society of Chemistry. Just a little bit about the journal I work on in case anyone hasn't heard of it. It's an open access journal covering basically all of chemistry. So it's actually one of our biggest journals at the RSC and the sort of main largest open access journal that we have at the moment. And I've been working on that journal for a couple of years now. So as Jay said, I'm going to be talking about paper mills primarily. So I'm going to start just by sort of giving an overview of what a paper mill is in case anyone isn't familiar with that. So it's defined as the systematic production of falsified research. So these are normally companies who offer sometimes editing and translation services, and on the side they'll also actually produce entirely fake articles made to order. So what usually happens is that an author would request a paper of a certain kind, and that company will produce figures, data, and write a fake paper. So it can be sometimes an author provides their own data and it's sort of put together by a company, but it also can be the actual entire thing is fabricated, including all the data, often with things like images taken from other papers that have previously been published and adjusted slightly and that kind of thing. It's also quite common for authorship to be sold, so scientists can pay to have their name included on papers that they didn't actually work on. And the price on that can depend on the location of the author. So, for example, a first or corresponding author might cost a higher price. And then one thing that we've seen a lot with paper mills particularly is that they often target medical researchers in China. So that's been the thing that we've noticed most at the RSC recently. And this is often because there's a lot of pressure on these particular researchers to publish, to achieve sort of the next level in their qualification, and often not enough time for them to do the research. So they're sort of targeted by these companies who want to take advantage of that and sell them papers that are faked in order to get them sort of further through their career. Although we have seen, and I know other publishers have seen these types of things with authors from other countries as well. So what happened at the RSC in particular is that we actually retracted 70 papers in January this year. And I've included a link there to sort of the announcement when we did that. From as far as we know, we were the first publisher to actually openly say that we thought we'd been a victim of a paper mill. So I know a lot of other publishers had retracted papers individually, but we hadn't seen anyone else at that stage. Although do correct me if anyone knows differently, where anyone had actually said that they thought the papers were from a paper mill. And in doing that, we worked with image and data integrity experts to sort of assess these papers and get to the bottom of what was going on. And we published individual, clear and detailed retraction notices for each one. And we really focused in our communication around this and being as open and as transparent as possible. We really wanted to make sure that others could learn from what we'd experienced and could help prevent this in the future. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about those sort of the aspects of how we did all that stuff later in the talk. We've had ongoing collaboration with other publishers since this happened as well. And we actually reported our case to both the Committee on Publication Ethics and Retraction Watch ahead of when we actually did the retractions. And the final thing we've done is to put actions in place to prevent further publications in future, which I'll also go into a bit later. So how did we detect these paper mill publications in the first place? So we've actually got an alert on our peer review system. So we use Scholar One at the Royal Society of Chemistry. And there's something called the unusual activity detector, which I'm sure others will have heard of. And that alert actually told us that there was that multiple papers had been submitted from the same computer, despite the authors being completely different on those papers. So we saw this coming up sort of suddenly in our system. Separately to that, we had an associate editor, so an academic working on the journal, who wasn't able to see these unusual activity detector things, had separately noticed unusual similarities between a number of unrelated papers. And we kind of realized that these were the same papers that were flagging up this alert. And finally, we'd been aware of submission patterns as highlighted by Elizabeth Bick and others in the media. So I've just put a link at the bottom there to Elizabeth Bick's particular blog post around this, which is a really interesting reading if anyone doesn't know much about this topic. So what we did was we developed a checklist of the indicators for these paper mill papers to help us try and identify them. And a lot of this is also based on what Elizabeth Bick highlighted in that blog post. So the first part was the types of data involved in those papers. So a lot of it contains Western blots, flow cytometry, cell assays, and microscopy. So really kind of biological data. We often saw signs of image manipulation, often minor things like cut and paste marks around the edges of images when you looked at them closely, or things where you saw kind of duplicated parts of an image in another image. As I mentioned before, a lot of these papers came from China, and actually most were affiliated to hospital or medical institutions. So whilst not on its own a kind of smoking gun for a paper mill paper, that fact combined with other things, kind of helped us to identify these papers. Often there was a lack of supplementary information or raw data. So often the images and figures for the papers were simply just JPEGs, so just pictures, and there wasn't actually any raw data backing that up, and no kind of supplementary data either. And there were a lot of non-institutional email addresses as well, so things like @Gmail, @163, and that kind of thing, and often actually just a string of numbers or letters instead of a person's name. So again, kind of an indication that this isn't necessarily attached to a specific author and certainly not to a specific institution, or possibly that the person who's actually submitted the paper isn't affiliated to the institution that's actually written as the corresponding author. And the final thing was really formulaic titles. So I've included an image here from Elizabeth Bick's blog post, and we actually found this really, really useful. So it's essentially what she developed as a kind of a flow chart for writing a title of one of these papers. So you insert the name of the molecule, you pick a verb, you then choose a cellular process, a cancer type, a connecting word, then another verb, and then the name of a pathway or an miRNA. And actually, we found that a lot of these papers titles almost, fit this perfectly. So that was a really, really good sign for us that we were looking at the right papers. So how did we investigate these and sort of move forward with our investigation? So once our suspicions were raised, as I mentioned, we had that unusual activity detector on Scholar One, and we actually asked Scholar One to generate a list of all the papers that had triggered that detector. From that, we then triaged those papers. So we used the checklist that I mentioned that we'd put together, ruled out anything that didn't meet any of the criteria or met only one or two, and kind of rated the papers by those that got the sort of most points on the checklist. And then going on from that, we started trying to gather more evidence. As I kind of mentioned COPE previously, so we were obviously a member of COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, and so we tried to follow their guidelines where we could. So we requested raw data from all the authors and asked for explanations for any instances of manipulation or duplication. And actually, a lot of the time, we didn't get any raw data back. I think it was only about 10% of the papers where we did. And then we consulted with an image integrity specialist who actually analysed all the data and all the images for us. And that person is, really experienced in actually looking at images using Photoshop to add different filters and things and really try and spot what's going on, spot duplicated areas. We ran authenticate reports on everything to check for text overlap. And we also used a tool that's available freely online called Seek and Blasten, which is a specific tool for identifying nucleotide sequencing errors. So a lot of the time, the person who developed this tool, Jennifer Byrne, she'd found that papers that had been fabricated would have a sequence of nucleotides saying that it generates a particular protein, but actually it was often wrong. That often wasn't actually the protein that sequence generated. And just simply scanning for papers where these had been kind of randomly put in as opposed to being actually accurate was a good way of finding papers that had issues. So we used that on some of the papers too. And then finally, we actually were able to retract quite a lot of these papers. So there were 70 in total. We published individual retraction notices for each one. So we wanted to make sure that even though we grouped them together as a group of papers retracted from being what we thought was part of a paper mill, we made sure we were clear on each individual paper what the issues were. So a lot of it was around image manipulation, unreliable data, so authors not being able to provide the raw data when we asked them, and quite often also unexpected similarities with other papers. So things like very, very similar layouts, very similar images and that kind of thing. And there was a public announcement from the Royal Society of Chemistry, and as I mentioned before, we notified Retraction Watch, COPE, and the institutions of all the authors as well. And so going on from that, we kind of wanted to go on to the next step, which was obviously to prevent this from happening again in future. So we've done a number of things around that. So it's consisted of additional screening checks at submission, strengthening our data requirements for authors, increasing awareness among our editorial and admin staff, training and awareness for our associate editors. Sorry, I keep pressing the wrong button. Training our staff in detection of image manipulation, and also piloting some software that can detect image manipulation. So in terms of those initial screening checks that we now do at submission, we screen papers for subject area, and those that sort of fit in the most common paper mill subject area we look at further. We look at author, institution and email address, the types of data included, and we ensure that raw data has actually been provided. We look for formulaic titles, manuscripts that are formatted in very similar ways, and also the absence of funding information can sometimes be a pointer as well. So we do look at that too. We've strengthened our data requirements. So initially, particularly for Western blots, because that was one of the main bits of data that was being manipulated in these papers, but we're in the process of updating them for other types of data as well. And we're empowering our associate editors, who are all academics, to reject papers that don't provide sufficient data. So to use that as a reason to reject a paper. We're also encouraging our authors now to make full data available for readers. And we've got some guidelines around that that we've just published as well, which is obviously really good practice so that readers can look at the full data that goes alongside your paper. In terms of increased awareness among our staff, We've obviously been raising awareness of the existence of paper mills at the RSC. We've been sharing those submission checking procedures with other journal teams. So obviously the journal I work on, RSC Advances, is one team, but the RSC publishes 45 different journals. So making sure that the people working on those know what's going on as well, and can look out for that kind of thing. And just making sure that we have increased familiarity with the indicators of paper mills. And we've also run training sessions for the associate editors that work on the journal. So we had a big webinar type session with them earlier in the year. We shared with them examples of manipulated images and formulaic titles and other things. And we've really encouraged them to start requesting raw data if they've got any concerns. We've given them a set of guidelines for actions to take if they do find suspicious papers. But they're really our final line of defense. So, we would hope that our initial submission checks would prevent most paper mill papers getting to our associate editors. But obviously, if they do get through, then we've got them as an extra kind of line of defense there. And the final thing we're looking to do at the moment is appoint reviewers with specific experience around image and data manipulation, so that if we do have any concerns around that kind of thing, then we can actually go to those reviewers and ask for their insight and their opinions. And then another thing we've done is actually with the person who did a lot of the image manipulation investigation, for us. They've given us a 2-day training session for a few members of our staff, really looking in depth at what they do and how they use Photoshop to identify those kinds of things. And, empowering our staff to start running their own checks and to help their associate editors to do that as well, and sharing that knowledge throughout the department. So from now on, if we do get a paper that we think is worth investigating, we think might be a paper from a paper mill, then we can actually look at that in Photoshop ourselves and try and use those skills to do that. And the final thing we've done is we've actually done a trial on a piece of software that can be used to screen for image manipulation. And we're currently working with the provider of that software to provide feedback and improve it. So this is something where you can sort of detect if things are duplicated within an individual paper, but it doesn't quite work like Authenticate. It doesn't look at kind of the rest of the literature at this stage. But we're always looking for other tools as well to add to our toolkit. So if anyone does have any suggestions, please do let me know. Sorry, I know I've gone over by a couple of minutes, but this is my final slide. So the final thing is just to say that we're really keen to share our learnings with other publishers. We really feel strongly that we need to work together to prevent this kind of thing. We've been having ongoing conversations with a number of other publishers already, and I'm really happy to have discussions with anyone else who wants to learn from what we've done or thinks that we can learn from what they've done. I think it's really, really important that, as a kind of industry, we work together to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen so much in the future. So thank you. That's all from me. And if you've got any questions, obviously we can answer them in the question and answer session at the end.
Yep. Thanks so much, Laura. And time to move on to Jason. Jason Roberts is a senior partner at Origin Editorial, an editorial office services and peer review management company. He's also the past president of the ISMTE. In 2017, he published the book Peer Review, Reform and Renewal in Scientific Publishing, and is an editorial board member of the journal Research Integrity and Peer Review by Springer Nature. Jason formally began a career in publishing with Blackwell Science, and today he'll be talking to us about predatory publishers. Take it away, Jason.
Hi, everyone. Greetings from Toronto, Canada, where it's not actually as cold as this photo looks. Here are my disclosures. Some of you know me already, and you know that I run Origin Editorial. And what I'm going to talk about today is predatory journals, but I'm not going to just go over the usual ground of what is a predatory journal. I'm actually going to, well, I will do a little bit of that, but I'm actually going to turn the focus around and put it back on us a little bit. And I think we have to ask the question, how is it that they're able to exist? What is it that I'm going to assume we're all legitimate journals here today. What are we doing or not doing that is allowing these publications to flourish? So I'll get right on with it. And first of all, what exactly is predatory publishing? So loosely it's defined, it's typically they offer rapid, unbelievably rapid peer review, unbelievable because you just simply cannot get it done in that time. And they offer unbelievably fast publication, while typically offering neither. So they do no peer review. And when they say publish, it doesn't follow all the traditional things that we associate with an article being published. It doesn't have a DOI. There's no mechanism to store this thing for posterity. So that's one way that we can define them. But there's obviously many are nefarious, as the loaded title predatory journal or predatory publishing implies. But many are just actually just awful journals by certain standards that we, I think, all uphold. And, this is why this term has been somewhat controversial, because it kind of denigrates these, what might actually be honest efforts. So the other thing that we need to clear up is that all predatory journals are open access, but most open access journals are not predatory. Okay, I can't believe I still have to actually remind people about that, but I think most of us here today understand that. So other common assumptions, that the people that publish there are gullible authors, alternatively, the authors are completely unpublishable. Their work is always rejected, and so this is where they go. Or that the authors themselves are seeking to be deceitful, or they've got corrupt or baseless results. However, there is evidence now that shows that this is not the case. There is NIH-funded research in there. There's probably pick other funders, and you'll find articles published. US-based authors are actually the second most likely country of origin. So thinking that it's authors in, I'm not going to name the countries, but they're out there, it's actually not necessarily the case. US authors dominate predatory publishing. So we if you want to look further at this, a great article of this is by David Moore and colleagues that was published in Nature in 2017. Okay, so you're working in an editorial office, or you're a publisher, a legitimate publisher. Why should you care? Well, I think there's different levels of why you should care. Perhaps you're an author, or you care about your authors. Well, they need to understand that their work is properly vetted, and they may not understand that that doesn't happen at predatory journals. I've certainly published editorials in my journal Headache on what predatory journal means, just to educate the author base, just say, be wary of this, not least because one of the tricks that predatory journals do is they create titles that are very much like the title of a well-known legitimate journal. So, I wanted to educate my author base. So that's one thing that you could do if you work in an editorial office. If you're a reader, you want to know that your content that you're reading has been validated, and that's simply something that you cannot know if an article has been published in a predatory journal. If you're an editor or maybe a publisher, you might be looking at, well, okay, I've launched a small journal. How do I make it not look like a predatory journal? I recently did a consultation for a group who'd been self-publishing for a couple of years, and they said, what do you think of our website? And I said, well, honestly, you look like a predatory journal. And they wanted to know why, and I told them why, and I'm going to go over that criteria in a moment in my next slide. So what defines predatory publishing? So Beale's list is obviously where most people have heard of predatory journals. Beale's list doesn't exist anymore. You can find it in deep corners of the internet, and I know Cabell's does something these days as well. But Beale came up with the term originally. I will say, and I've met Jeffrey Beale, he even said it to my face, is that he rather arbitrarily applied predatory journal rather than using an evidence base. He didn't just go, that's predatory, that's not predatory. He did have some science, but his methods have never been written down. So I don't think anyone here could accurately get their list to match his, because there's no evidence-based criteria that he came up with. Beale did create some confusion by frequently conflating open access with predatory journals. And unfortunately, I don't think he obviously intended this, but he stigmatized poor quality and often regionally specific but honest journals. And if you go to certain parts of the world, you might find that departments publish a journal, and it publishes more than just the people in that department. But and sometimes these do look quite amateur efforts, and unfortunately, stigmatism created from this this term predatory journal. So I was part of a paper, Shamsir et al. In 2017. It was published in BMC Medicine. That we actually looked at 100 legitimate journals, 100 journals that were on Beale's list, and 100 legitimate open access journals. When I say 100 legitimate journals, I should have said 100 hybrid or traditional subscription journals. So we looked at these journals and we looked at what are the characteristics of potential predatory journals. And I'm telling you this just so that you could maybe be thinking, does my journal actually, could that get counted for one or two of these things? So the first thing was that the scope of interest was way beyond, what it's supposed to be. I got solicitation for a forestry journal, but they were asking, they saw an article I published in the Journal of Sexual Medicine. So, what's the connection there? I don't know. There's obvious errors with English grammar and syntax, spelling, often fuzzy graphics. I mean, it sounds a bit arbitrary, but if you go to an Elsevier site or a Wiley site, you're not going to get super fuzzy graphics on the homepage of the journal. The language targets authors. So if you go to the homepage, it's all about, hey, how to be an author for this journal at a predatory journal. They keep promoting this index Copernicus value, which is a nonsense metric. There's no description of the manuscript handling process. Now, this is one that we all might want to think about. Do we actually describe how we handle the manuscripts? Do we describe how our peer review is done? Like how many people look at it? Is there a methodologist that looks at it? So there's maybe something that we could be learning here. Manuscripts are submitted via email, promises of rapid publication. There's no absence of retraction policy. If they come up with one, they probably copy and pasted it from a more prominent journal. There's no way of knowing about, did they just make the stuff up? Did they follow it? There's no information on the preservation of content, very low article processing charges, copyright. They claim to retain copyright. Well, how does that work in an open access journal? And this is an interesting one, non-professional or non-journal email addresses. Now, I must admit, in the past, I've used a Gmail address for a small journal I worked on. So this is something or other that maybe we want to take a look at. So, if you're at a particular society, use that address rather than the Gmail address. Okay, they often can be defined by their behavior, which is their email solicitation campaigns. I'm bringing this to your attention because you may do this. Just beware. I've seen legitimate publishers do something that's not so different than what I'm showing you on screen here, and that's not a good look. So I love this particular request because it was actually said that we are writing to express our deep impression of your previous paper entitled Response and Rebuttal, more on predatory journals. So they basically saw a predatory journal article I wrote and said, can you submit to this predatory journal of ours? But why am I showing you this? Because a couple of things. One is that the greetings are usually either overly formal, dear esteemed Professor Dr. Roberts, or it's actually really informal. And, the balance doesn't seem right. And the non-standard use of English as well, which again, it's like, I get it. English is not the first language of the majority of this world. But, there are certain things that just unfortunately are a bit of a giveaway. Okay, so why is predatory publishing problematic? And this is going to feed into the bit that I really want you guys to all feast on. Well, the problem is this, is that good, valid science often remains unusable or undiscoverable, because that's the thing, is that if you get published in a predatory journal, good luck trying to find that. I mean, Google will bury that somewhere deep, deep down, but you're not going to find it on the legitimate databases, which is how a lot of people still search. You're using PubMed Central or whatever the equivalent database is in non-clinical medicine fields. Conversely, the potential exists that if people do find it, they don't necessarily understand, if they're not necessarily paying attention, that might not have been peer reviewed, and suddenly get sucked up into a review article, and the next thing you know, we're going off on a research cul-de-sac. And we really, so it's like it's the one extreme or the other, is that you can't be found, and if it is found, it might get used inappropriately. That if you're an author, you may find that the funders won't recognize that it's been published, and if you've gone and put it in an open access journal, good luck trying to then put that in a legitimate journal. And so, your funder's looking for you to have got published, and now you've blown your primary results in a predatory journal. The relationship between dishonest researchers and predatory journals is obvious, and there is a symbiotic relationship. There are authors that are definitely out to scam, and they know exactly where to get published, and unfortunately, people again aren't paying attention, and it gets sucked up into the literature. And the presence of predatory journals in the marketplace creates confusion amongst authors. No matter where they are in the world, they don't understand, is this legitimate or not? And I think people are getting better, but you'll still be amazed at how many people can get duped. And the fact of the matter is that the predatory journals are getting better at being a facsimile of a legitimate journal. Okay, so what does the existence of predatory journals tell us about legitimate journals? So this is the navel-gazing bit, but this is why I think we need to stop and think about what are we doing that is enabling these journals to exist. Now, obviously, there's some major issues which I'll just explore first of all. So predatory journals do reflect back and expose many of the ongoing issues in legitimate publishing, is that it is complicated and labor intensive to get published, and peer review is also complicated and labor intensive. But a lack of transparency actually hides that, and so that enables predatory journals to blend in. A lot of people think that they don't understand. They don't understand the work that we do. I say we, and if you work in an editorial office, they certainly don't understand all the work that goes into getting an article published. This is why some people think everything should be free. Well, a lot of people work to get that to where it is. But if we don't tell people about that or show them what's going on in the background, why would they know? We know because we work in it. The secrecy associated with peer review means we often do not know how journals actually validate the content that they publish. So, consider publishing an editorial saying this is how we peer review papers. Otherwise, how do we know how journals publish it? And God only knows. We see so many cases where journals clearly haven't really peer reviewed a paper and it's got published and then blown up. And that's gone from the very top journals. It's not just the small little, quarterlies, barely scraping by. And the mega journals too are guilty of this. We have this culture of publish or perish in academia that has created a demand that legitimate journals cannot fill. We just simply cannot cope with the material that's coming in. So people get shunted off to the sidelines. They still have to get published. So, along comes the source that says, hey, I can publish for you. People, if you're desperate, or people, if that's the only option, that's what they're going to pursue. And of course, the big elephant in the room, no more, because we are at least finally talking about this, is that journals are very Western-centric. And so, this is not just a price point. That's an obvious issue. The price point is very expensive to publish in open access, very expensive to subscribe to a journal. But beyond that, there is there are many other cultures out there in how you disseminate knowledge. And, the Western one is it's the predominant one, but it's not the only one. And so that's why, particularly when I talk about, stigmatizing the journals that are, they look amateur by our efforts, but are actually maybe perfectly acceptable in other research cultures, and to stigmatize them, that's problematic. Let's be honest, flawed and fake research is passing through peer review too. So, it's not a good reflection on us that we're doing that. So to say, well, peer review journals are doing this, predatory journals are doing this, we're doing it too. Peer review is too time consuming and frequently adds little value. You could spend months reviewing a paper and you literally get 3 lines back that as an author, you're like, wow, what happened there? That was a complete waste of time. Now, I know that preprints are one way that we're trying to contend with that, but journals need to look at, are we actually delivering something that's actually any good here? We're taking a lot of time, but do we actually add any value? I talked about cost. Also, production quality is sloppy. There's unfortunately the lack of clear editing, poor quality images, lack of clear and up-to-date instructions for authors and reviewers. All journals, I think, have some element of this. I definitely think that the quality of copy editing is not where it used to be. As much as we have digital technology today, I think figure quality in some respects has gone backwards when people are slipping in 76 DPI images, and that seems to end up getting published and they just look like garbage. And so it's very easy to just, pass yourself off as, well, we're about as good as that legitimate journal over there if you're a predatory journal. So what should legitimate journals do better? These are my final few slides. Well, okay, so first of all, you should all become familiar with the common traits of predatory journals and make sure you do not replicate their behaviors. So I gave you a little bit of that up front there with the 13 criteria. There are many other things. So look at your communications. Is the language appropriate? Are you too formal? Are you too informal? Actually, I had a letter that must have been sat there for 7 years. There was a typo in it. Nobody ever said anything. It was only when I updated the letter I saw the typo. So these sort of things reflect badly. God knows how many people saw that. And, it's kind of embarrassing. So I'm as guilty as everyone else. Does your journal homepage contain clear instructions and makes claims that can be easily validated? So, first of all, are you clearly describing what it is that you do? in your peer review process, what you want from authors, but also what you're about. So if you have an impact factor, make sure you report that properly. Describe your archival policies. Usually publishers will do that because they're the ones that handle that, but make sure your journal does at least mention that. Make sure that your indexing is properly worded and is actually accurate and up to date. And also just make sure, particularly, I don't know where you all publish, but just make sure that you are actually using reputable sources. There are a couple of people that will claim that they are legitimate sources, and they're not. Another giveaway, actually, just a little side note, is that if I see a journal that says we're on Google Scholar, that's a sure flag right there that it's a predatory journal, because Google Scholar is a search engine, it's not a database. For journals not indexed or holding an impact factor, avoid promoting the dubious metrics. That's what I'm trying to get at. But also just, be upfront. No need to hide about it. Just say if you've got an application in at DOAJ, if you've got an application in something else, then you can say it's coming. Publish an editorial. If you're a new journal, saying this is what we're going to be doing down the road. Put that editorial on your homepage. Okay, be transparent. Now, I'm not saying fully open peer review. That's not what I'm saying here. That's another conversation, another time. But what I'm saying is that you can, at the very least, say what it is you do and why you do it. If you have the statistician and the methods advisor say that every paper that is going to have that applied to it. So, as an author, you're aware that that's going to happen. Provide a copy of instructions for reviewers. Now, you could put those up on your website if you want. Or, when you talk to your reviewers, actually give them that information so they know what they're looking for. You don't need to hide that. I mean, it's fairly common stuff. It's like, look for this, look for that. There's no secret source that's going to make your journal any better by hiding your instructions for reviewers. Explain how reviewers are selected and what expectations they are to meet. I think that's critical in this day and age, particularly as we're now way more sensitive to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Say how you are actually picking people. I've been around in this business long enough to know that in the past it was very much an old boys club and who they picked, and so you need to be transparent in how you go about that selection process. Detail the criteria for acceptance and rejection. Consider publishing peer review comments if both the authors and the reviewers allow that, and highlight your publication ethics policies. A lot of predatory journals say we're members of COPE, which is something you can't verify unless you want to write to COPE. So actually just spell out what it is, because they typically don't. And if they do, it's very minimal. They might just say, yeah, we've got a policy on retractions. But what is it? It's not a meaningful thing. Okay, so quick tips, a couple of slides to go. Check your journal homepage. Make sure your instructions for authors are both free of spelling and colloquialisms and grammar and syntax errors. Check that the images and logos are of a high resolution as possible. If it's not, work with your publisher or do it yourself and make sure you get high resolution up there. Clearly identify who your editor-in-chief and editorial members are. Include information on the institution where they work. Be amazed at how many journals don't do that, and that's actually helpful in letting us break down, is this a legitimate journal or not? It's much more easy to verify the information. Ensure that the journal owner, for instance, the society, and the publisher are clearly identified. So we know who's behind this. State you have manuscript handling process. If you use COPE to guide your response to publication ethics, and state this support, but maybe, like I said, put your ethical guidelines up there. State if you actively support ORCID, the use of authenticate, cross-ref, and cross-mark. Again, those are verifiable things, and predatory journals aren't typically going to be supporting that. And if you mandate some form of study registration prior to submission, such as registering a clinical trial at clinicaltrials.gov, make sure that is clearly stated. These are all things that predatory journals don't do. Okay, consider using an email address that has your society name or your publisher name, whatever. For open access journals, ensure that you are listed in DOAJ. If you're not, then be actively working towards it. DOAJ has had issues in the past, but it is a really good source of information on what is a legitimate open access journal. Provide your journal ISSN number, because that is something that can be verified. And I see that some predatory journals come up with fake ISSN numbers, but you can very quickly find that those are fake. Okay, so it's, make sure that information is out there and that it's prominent and not deeply buried on the fourth page below some sub menu. And mention your policy for the preservation of digital content and disclose who retains the copyright. And finally, COPE's core practices, make sure that you're aware of them. So go to COPE and have a read of them. Make sure that you are following those as closely as possible. So my conclusions are basically just take a good old look at yourself, and are you doing a polished job at your end? Are you being as clear and as transparent as you could be? And just beware that there are plenty of folks out there that are maybe trying to mimic you. You've got to make sure that you're on your toes and doing the best job possible. Thank you.
All right, just want to thank both of our speakers for some excellent talks. Given that we have just 5 minutes left for the session, I'll share one question to each of you that have come through. Laura, maybe we'll start with you. Are open access journals more susceptible to receiving papers from paper mills?
So I think that's a really interesting question. I saw it come up before Jason's talk, actually, so I was having a bit of a think about it while he was talking. I think it relates quite a lot, actually, to some of what Jason said at the start of his talk. So I don't think that an open access journal necessarily on its own is, but I think, as Jason mentioned, all predatory journals are usually open access, and it kind of goes hand in hand with a person who's trying to publish a fake piece of research, that they might try and publish it in a journal that's not going to have very rigorous peer review and that kind of thing. So the fact that then there are other open access journals that do have rigorous peer review and that are legitimate, it might mean that they're associated with those predatory journals, and therefore it might mean that it is more likely that you'd receive those submissions. Having said that, not every paper that we retracted was published in RFC Advances. There was some in a couple of our other journals as well that aren't open access. So certainly, it's not they're not the only journals that get these papers. But I would say there is some link, and I'd say that it is because of the predatory journals.
Thanks, Laura. And Jason, this one's directed at you, I guess. How long will it be before predatory journals are also meeting all of these checks, at least ostensibly? There are sophisticated and unsophisticated predators now.
Mm-hmm. That's a brilliant question. And I've thought about this a lot, because when that BMC article came out with the 13 points, people said, haven't you just given them a blueprint for how to become legitimate journals? And one argument is, well, yeah, if they become legitimate, then they become a publisher. It doesn't mean to say that the big 4, 5, 6 publishers we have today are the only publishers, And I think back to, in Britain in the 60s, the BBC was the only radio broadcaster. And so you had things called pirate radio stations that used to broadcast in the North Sea. But all the DJs there were playing the popular music at the time. They all became the main DJs of the future. They became on Radio 1. They were the, they were the people that people listened to. I'm saying is that we could find that these pirate publishers now, maybe some of them become legitimate down the road, because if you keep having to, reach these hurdles that I talk about, eventually, what's the point in being a predatory journal publisher? You might as well just be legitimate. So that could well happen. I certainly think that the higher we make the standards, if a publisher that's predatory wants to make leap, good on them. For the rest, it'll become even more obvious that they're fake.
Thanks, Jason. Maybe I'll do one last question. Laura, how about this one? How did you identify reviewers who had experience in image manipulation?
So interesting question. And actually, we are still in the process of trying to do that. So at the moment, I can't actually tell you, because we're sort of still working on how we're actually going to go about doing that. Obviously, we did use someone who's an expert in image manipulation when we were doing our investigation, and so that person can obviously help us out and point to a few of their other contacts. And it would generally be looking for people who have published on this kind of thing. So there are a lot of articles out there on publishing ethics and manipulation of images and that kind of thing. There are a lot of people who are active on Twitter who and other social media platforms who look for problems with papers and images and that kind of thing. So I think we'll be starting with looking into those people, having a look at their kind of background and credentials and seeing if they're the kinds of people that we would want to have as reviewers for the journal.
Got it. And with that, I think we've come to the end of this session. So please join me in thanking Laura and Jason for some outstanding talks. Thank you so much.
Thank you.